In our previous video, we spoke of the lead-up to Vatican II and the events immediately following it. In this video, we will skip ahead to a little over 20 years after the Second Vatican Council. By this point, a variety of sedevacantist movements and organizations had been emerging within the Catholic Church, but most were relatively small, with no more than a few hundred or maybe a few thousand supporters at most. One of the largest religious organizations within the Traditionalist movement was Archbishop Lefebvre's group, the Society of St. Pius X. Yet, by the late 1980s, Archbishop Lefebvre knew that he was getting old. By this point, he was already in his late 70s, early 80s. And so he wanted to ensure that the Society of St. Pius X would continue even after his death. So, in June of 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre selected 4 priests from his order and consecrated them to the status of bishop, with the intention of them leading the group after his death. Yet, since Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated them as bishops without papal approval, something that violates the Code of Canon Law, he was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Thankfully, the options for the Church didn't remain either puppet masses or cathar masses on the one hand, and schism on the other. Up until this point, only the SSPX and the various sedevacantist groups were offering the traditional Latin Mass. Any form of the Latin Rite liturgy prior to the 1969 edition of the Roman Missal was prohibited by the Church. There were some exceptions. Pope St. Paul VI, for example, stated that every Catholic priest of the Latin Rite had to adopt the new rite of Mass by Advent of 1971. Yet a group of intellectuals and artists in England spoke out against this decision and wrote a letter to the Pope asking him to allow them to continue to use the traditional Latin Mass. In response, Pope Paul VI allowed them to use the 1965 edition of the Roman Missal. As some of you may know, in the period between 1964 and 1969, a series of new liturgical rubrics were created in an early attempt to implement the liturgical reforms called for by the Council. Many of these early attempts at liturgical reform were still somewhat similar to the pre-Vatican II liturgy. Thus, as a concession, Pope Paul VI allowed the Catholics of England and Wales to use these earlier forms of the post-conciliar liturgy. Things seemed bleak for supporters of the traditional Latin Mass until the mid-1980s. In 1984, the Congregation for Divine Worship, speaking on behalf of the Pope, Pope St. John Paul II, issued a decree titled Quantur Arpinc Annos, which decreed that bishops may allow priests within their diocese to celebrate the Latin Mass, so long as they showcase an acceptance of the Second Vatican Council. In 1988, after the illicit consecrations of Archbishop Lefebvre, Pope St. John Paul II published an apostolic letter titled Ecclesia Dei, in which he condemned the actions of Archbishop Lefebvre. Yet, John Paul, even in this document, affirmed the right of the priests and the people to ask their bishop to allow them to celebrate the Latin Mass, and affirmed the right of the bishops to grant this permission, saying that there must be a, and I quote, wide and generous application of the directives already issued some time ago by the Apostolic See, unquote. That is to say, when you look at the regulations put forward by Quatuor Arpinc Annos, bishops are to implement those regulations in the broadest possible manner. In light of this, Pope St. John Paul II promulgated what was known as the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, an organization within the Vatican meant to study and regulate the various issues concerning the Latin Mass and the Traditionalist movement more generally. Nonetheless, the celebration of the Latin Mass remained relatively rare within the mainstream church. This changed in 2007, when Pope Benedict XVI published the Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum. In that document, Pope Benedict asserted that the liturgical rubrics of Pope St. Paul VI were the normative expression of the Latin Rite liturgical tradition, but nonetheless the liturgical rubrics used before the changes taking place after Vatican II were permitted to be said. This would thus lay the basis for the terms often used to describe these two forms of the Latin Rite liturgy, the ordinary form and the extraordinary form. Further, Pope Benedict decreed that any priest permitted to celebrate the Mass in the Latin Rite could celebrate the extraordinary form even without permission of either the Holy See or their local bishop. Priests can celebrate the extraordinary form of their own initiative, and the lay faithful can ask the clergy to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass without having to go through any higher authority. In fact, Pope Benedict went so far as to assert that if a priest refuses to celebrate the Latin Mass for a group of faithful who ask for it, they may appeal to their local bishop, and if the bishop refuses to grant them a Latin Mass, they may appeal to the Ecclesia Dei Commission. Pope Benedict's decree loosened many of the regulations on the traditional Latin Mass, even beyond what was originally brought about by his venerable predecessor. In the letter to the world's bishops that accompanied this motu proprio, Pope Benedict outlines his intentions in promulgating this decree. His intentions were not to undermine the authority of the Second Vatican Council or the reforms that followed, but rather his proper intentions were twofold. Firstly, his intention was ecumenical. Pope Benedict hoped that by making the Latin Mass more readily available to the average Catholic, he could bring about reconciliation between the mainstream church and the more radical branches of the traditionalist movement, especially the Society of St. Pius X. Secondly, and most importantly, Pope Benedict wanted to make known the fact that both the ordinary and extraordinary forms of the Latin Rite liturgy were legitimate expressions of the spiritual and liturgical patrimony of the West. If this was the case, then both must be accepted, respected, and allowed. If we are to accept the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council as being legitimate, and therefore binding on the consciences of believers, then the Missal of Pope Paul VI is to be seen as the normative liturgy of the West. Nonetheless, true reform, liturgical or otherwise, does not negate, but rather builds on what came before it. This was summarized in the following quote from Benedict, which became one of the most popular maxims of liturgical theology from the Pope Emeritus's teachings. Quote, "In the history of the liturgy, there is growth and progress, but never rupture. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or entirely harmful." Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict were motivated by a particular theological mindset that attempted to create a middle ground between the radical liberalism of the 1960s and 1970s and the radical traditionalist reactionary to it. Unlike the radical traditionalist, Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict accepted Vatican II as a valid council of the Church. Yet these two popes also attempted to curtail the liberalism that rampaged the Church in the middle of the last century. Such an attempt to create a middle ground was rooted in the belief that while Vatican II was a legitimate council, many at the time of the council misinterpreted and misapplied it. This was because they fundamentally misinterpreted the general intentions of the council. Misinterpreting the council was something that itself resulted from an attempt to accept and interpret the council in a vacuum, in a manner divorced from the larger tradition of the Church. What Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict suggested was that the council, in order to be properly interpreted and implemented, needed to be interpreted in light of the larger 2,000-year tradition of the Church. Yes, Church teaching needed to be infused with a certain level of intellectual nuance in order to confront the circumstances of the modern world, but there is nonetheless a difference between adapting the teachings of the Church, or how we express it, to the modern world, and, on the other hand, fundamentally changing the meaning of or departing from traditional Church teaching. Such a mindset was labeled the hermeneutics of continuity, a term first coined by Pope Benedict himself. And the theological mindset of the liberal radicals of the 1960s and 1970s was labeled the hermeneutics of rupture. The hermeneutics of continuity allowed the traditional Latin Mass to coexist alongside the post-Vatican II liturgy. This, in turn, led to the rise, particularly in the period between the late 1980s and today, of what could be called a more quote-unquote moderate branch of the traditionalist movement. Those traditionalist Catholics who, unlike their more radical counterparts, did not fall into or come close to schism, and still accepted the council as legitimate, though they preferred the more traditional forms of worship and the more traditional theological language. Groups that fall into this category include several different priestly and religious orders, including the Institute of Christ the King and Sovereign Priest, founded in 1990, and the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, which was founded in 1988. This thus caused, particularly within the past a little over a decade, a drastic increase in the number of priests, religious orders, and parishes that regularly offer the traditional Latin Mass. And, especially within the past 10 to 15 years or so, at least since the promulgation of Summorum Pontificum, most Latin Mass communities went relatively unregulated and unbothered by the Church. All of this came to an end on July 14, 2021, when Pope Francis promulgated the decree Traditionis Custodes, which placed heavy restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. According to Traditionis Custodes, 1. Priests can only celebrate the traditional Latin Mass if they are proficient in Latin. 2. Priests can only celebrate the traditional Latin Mass if they have the permission of their local bishop. 3. Bishops are not to approve of the creation of any new parishes, religious orders, or other organizations wherein the traditional Latin Mass is the sole or primary form of worship. 4. Bishops can determine the location and time in which a Latin Mass is celebrated. And 5. All priests who wish to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass must first demonstrate that they accept the Second Vatican Council as valid. Many commentators in the Catholic Church had seen this coming for many years. Pope Francis was highly critical of the traditionalist movement during most of his papacy. And it also seems as if Traditionis Custodes had been in the work for quite some time, and that some of the bishops in the church knew about it but didn't say anything. For example, this past June, the Archbishop of Dijon in France, Reverend Roland Minorath, ordered that the Fraternal Society of St. Peter leave his diocese. A few weeks later, when a group of protesters appeared at his house, Archbishop Minorath began to explain himself. He stated that since the Missal of Pope Paul VI was the normative liturgy of the Western Church, all members of the Fraternal Society of St. Peter had to con-celebrate the post-Vatican II liturgy with the local diocesan priests during the Chrism Mass on Holy Thursday, in order to show their communion with the larger Catholic Church. and since they refused to do that, they were thus a problem for the local church. Bishop Minerath even went as far as to say that the Pope would publish a new motu proprio on the Latin Mass, quote, in a few days or weeks, unquote, and even put forward the ominous statement, quote, the Pope will speak, I know what he will say, unquote. Obviously, these events have caused much controversy within the Church, with many more conservative commentators taking to various social media outlets and Catholic publications to make known their disapproval of Pope Francis's decision. This controversy went all the way to the heights of the hierarchy. Within 2 days after the publication of Traditionis Custodes, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, the Archbishop of San Francisco, published a statement wherein he said that he would allow the traditional Latin Mass to continue unhindered in his diocese. Bishop Edward Scharfenberger, the Bishop of Albany, also put forward a statement within a few days of the publication of Traditionis Custodes, in which he spoke of the great pastoral and spiritual good that the Latin Mass has provided for his diocese. Other bishops were, of course, not as generous. The Bishop of Little Rock, Bishop Anthony Taylor, prohibited the celebration of the Latin Mass in all but 2 parishes, both run by the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, claiming that this and similar groups were the only exceptions to the Pope's recent decree. Other bishops were on the fence. The Diocese of Arlington in Virginia put forward a statement in which they said that the bishop would review the document further, but that at least for the weekend immediately following the passing of the decree, parishes could celebrate the traditional Latin Mass without hindrance. Bishop Thomas Tobin, the Bishop of Rhode Island, stated that Traditionis Custodes, quote, is both a challenge and an opportunity, unquote, and that how he will implement this decree is something that he will make known in the future, after a period of study and prayer. In late July, Bishop Tobin delivered a short address at a local parish run by the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, in which he said the following.
But I want you to be at peace. I want to say that as I've read the Motu Proprio of Pope Francis and its accompanying letter, I find nothing there that threatens the existence of St. Mary's Church, nor the ministry of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter among you.
On August 1st, 2021, a group of Catholic laypeople co-wrote an article for the Italian publication Il Foglio, titled, A Public Letter from the Catholic Laity, Francis, Enough, Stop the Ideological Civil War in the Church, in which they stated that Pope Francis's main theological motif, the Church as an institution that goes into the world and actively engages and evangelizes it, has been undermined by recent events. Among these are the many financial and sexual scandals that have plagued the Church, the closing of churches due to COVID, the Vatican's deal with China, and, most importantly, the recent regulations on the Latin Mass. The restriction of the Latin Mass, along with the other events mentioned above, scandalizes the faithful, turns the different factions within the Church against each other, and degrades those who attempt to hold the proper interpretation of the faith. On August 14th, Cardinal Robert Serra wrote an essay for the French newspaper Il Figaro, in which he stated that the Church is the foundation of modern civilization. And what is more, the Church offers something that even other important factors in civilizational life cannot or do not offer, namely an encounter with God, and therefore a transcendent basis for man's higher cultural activity. The Church is an anchor, a beacon, which orients man in an otherwise chaotic world, without which the human race knows nothing but chaos, arbitrariness, and disorientation. Because of this, the Church has recognized that its teachings are rooted in certain eternal realities, and thus, even as the Church has changed or developed over time, there has still remained a sense of consistency underlying everything the Church has said and done. If the Church were to outlaw the traditional Latin Mass, then the Church would be implying that its perennial tradition, handed on to it by God, can be changed by anyone at any time for any reason. This would undermine the Church's role as a source of social cohesion. Thus, the Church is at a crossroads. It can either find a way to ensure the peaceful coexistence of the ordinary and extraordinary forms, or it can lose its moral and spiritual credibility. In our first video, we examined the history of Vatican II and its immediate aftermath. And in this video, we examined the history of the mainlining of the traditional Latin Mass, as well as a summary of Pope Francis's recent decree and the controversies that resulted from it. In the next video, we will talk about my personal thoughts on this topic and what I think the future holds for the traditional Latin Mass community and the Church as a whole. Thank you very much, and God bless.